Okay, thank you very much and good morning, everyone. And I hope it's warmer where you are than it is in London. It's gone back to freezing cold in London. Very briefly, before going into framing, I'll give you a quick snapshot of my background. For 28 years, I was a journalist with the BBC, mainly with the BBC World Service. My very first job with the BBC was in a part called the Monitoring Service, where I monitored foreign radio broadcasts, initially from a huge old Downton Abbey type stately home outside Reading. And I monitored Radio Moscow in English, including Radio Moscow in English to Africa, and I monitored Radio RSA, the external arm of SABC during the apartheid era. And that was from 1980 through until 1983. And part of that time I monitored from Malawi so that we could get a better signal from there. I then moved on a few years later to the main World Service, where I worked in the African service for a while, alongside some really exceptional African journalists, people like Joseph Warungu, Elizabeth Ahini, Josephine Casely-Hayford, Ben Malor, lots of them. And I learned a huge amount from them, which was very important, because one of the big problems with framing news about South Africa and in a wider context, Africa in Britain, is people are not, journalists are not necessarily plugged in to the people, the areas they're reporting on. They have an understanding, even if they have traveled, say, in South Africa or Kenya or Tanzania or Nigeria or Ghana, they still tend to have a fairly static view of African realities and of the extremely diverse nature of Africa. And that's something they miss, I think, a lot of them. So at the World Service, working in the African service, and then in the English language service of World Service News, where our biggest single audience was in Nigeria, and very big audiences in the rest of English-speaking West Africa, East Africa, and down into Southern Africa. You know, I gained this insight that when you are broadcasting about the continent, firstly, it is so diverse. I don't know if any of you have come across it. It's worth looking at because it's quite in some ways, an amusing website called Africa is a Country. And the name is deliberately cynical, satirical, in order to bring across the point that Africa is actually many, many countries. It is not one country. You could not, for example, say Europe is a country. It is made up of many different countries, cultures, linguistic groups, the same in Africa. So I learned a lot. I was lucky enough because I'd been out and monitored in Africa. I then took lots of trips of my own, particularly to East and Southern Africa, though until 1990, I was very, very much not wanted in South Africa by the National Party government. Because, and I make no apologies for this, in fact, it's something I'm still extremely proud of, as well as working for the BBC, until I was directly broadcasting for the BBC under my own name, I was able to write on a monthly basis and be on the editorial board of Anti-Apartheid News, the newspaper of the British anti-apartheid movement. So I had that to my bow as well, and through that, met in London, in Tanzania, in Zambia, South Africans who were opposed to apartheid. I interviewed Thabo and Becky several times in exile. I hope you're hearing me, because I've just got a message up on my screen saying my internet connection is unstable. So do shout out if I suddenly disappear. And I met many other very important, brave South Africans. I will now move on, rather than talking about me all the time, to talking about framing and how I see framing coming from that background. Framing, and I'm sure in public relations you come across this. How are you going to frame a product, a company, an event? So what are you going to describe about it? In journalism, when you are approaching a news story or writing a feature, whether for radio, TV, online, something that's going to go out on social media, or the old traditional way, newspapers, you are thinking of a frame. It is like a picture frame. What is going within the frame of my story? What am I going to select as important? What am I going to exclude as unimportant? Then within the story, there is another aspect, and that is representation. How are you going to represent issues, countries, people, movements within your story? And that is very, very important. And one I think of the really big problems in the way that stories about South Africa and Africa are framed is that too many journalists have inherited, and I have to say, throwback inheritances to colonialism and to events in the immediate post-colonial period. There's a very good journalist that I know. He now lives in Cape Town. He's a British journalist. His name is Tim Butcher, and he was the defence correspondent and then the Africa correspondent of the Daily Telegraph newspaper. And he told me, and he put it in a book that he published on a journey he took through the Democratic Republic of Congo. He said when he first became Africa correspondent at the Daily Telegraph, an old hack being a name for a journalist, it's a name I take on myself. My Twitter handle is KS Africa Hack. I don't mind being called a hack. I think it's quite amusing. He said an old hack, an old journalist at the Telegraph said, when you go out to Africa, remember there are only two things we want to know: how many dead and what tribe. And that sums up two of the basic frames, stereotypical frames, that are used to look at events in African countries, events in the continent as a whole, certainly events in South Africa. What tribe do people belong to? And you may well disagree with me. Please do, if you get the chance to ask me questions. You may well disagree with me about the importance of tribe. I find tribe a very questionable description, and it's one I think when applied to Africa by European, North American journalists has so much baggage with it that even if you believe it can be used in other circumstances as a description of identity, as a frame in the media, it has so much baggage that I just don't think it should be used. And that baggage is that it is generally used to imply something primitive, something potentially violent, something to the European, North American psyche, something that is gone, is that they have got beyond, but that in Africa, parts of West Asia, South Asia, people haven't got beyond. And I'll give a couple of examples of why I think this is the case. In 2007, 2008, there was violence in Kenya after elections. The violence was because supporters of the opposition movement, led by the man who now may be Kenya's next president, Raila Odinga, came onto the streets to protest against the incumbent president and his party stealing the election by faking votes to inflate the size of their vote and say we have been elected back in. This was a political struggle between rival political movements. And yes, they had power bases among particular communities in Kenya, but they weren't protesting. The ODM were not protesting against Mwai Kibaki, the president, as a Kikuyu, or some of his supporters as Kikuyu. They were protesting against the theft of the election. Yet in the British media, this was presented, and I have to say, I was most disappointed because the person who used this expression on the BBC was somebody who'd been one of my editors when I was a young producer on news programs. She is somebody I respected hugely, and somebody who was one of the real experts on the Soviet Union and then post-Soviet Russia. And I would love to hear what she has to say about Ukraine. But she was, as we called it, the duty dog in news gathering as the foreign affairs correspondent based in London when the violence started. And she described it as primeval tribal bloodshed, the worst bloodshed we've seen for years in Africa. Not in Kenya, in Africa. Had to be Africa because you widen it out to get the frame of Africa. Now, 10 years before, in fact, more than 10 years before, you had the war in Bosnia, the war in Croatia, related to the breakup of Yugoslavia. Did they talk of tribalism? No. They talked of rival nationalisms, Serb nationalism, Bosnian nationalism, Croatian nationalism. This wasn't tribalism, this was nationalism. This was stepping beyond, this was more modern, this was talking about nations. And I actually believe you should use the word nation or community and not tribe. And that brings me on to the stereotypical frames that are used about Africa. Corruption, as though there is not corruption anywhere else in the world. In Britain, and the COVID crisis has really brought this out, I know there's the expression in South Africa, tenderpreneurship, preferential treatment in being awarded tenders, being awarded government contracts. And this may be corrupt, money may pass hands. Happens in Britain as well. And yet the corruption frame is used widely. The crime frame, particularly relating to South Africa. Now, I've been to South Africa, I think about a dozen times since 1990, when I was allowed in as a BBC journalist and they couldn't keep me out despite my anti-apartheid background. 12 times. In those 12 times, I've never been threatened. I've never been robbed. I've never really felt unsafe. Now, I know crime is a serious problem. Violent crime is a serious problem, but it is not the only aspect of South Africa. And yet the crime frame comes up, even in stories which may be about a crime, but are not about the wider issue of crime. You get this reference to the frame. So I can remember when the para athlete Oscar Pistorius shot and killed his partner, was tried and put in prison. It was the sort of appalling domestic violence that happens across the world. And yet in British media reporting, it was reported as something almost purely South African. It fell into the crime frame, which in my view it didn't. It was a crime that fell into a global domestic violence problem frame. You then get the disease frame or the famine frame. And with the disease frame, something that jumped out at me recently was when South African medical scientists isolated the Omicron variant, they were doing something that should have been highlighted as a success. Instead, you saw in British newspapers, they had this story saying super vaccine resistant Omicron virus runs wild in Botswana and is going to sweep across South Africa in a way you've never seen. Suddenly, COVID was fitted into a wider Africa is the continent of disease. Botswana is now breeding this super mutant. It will sweep across South Africa. But when you look at the figures, it's not right. Britain's daily COVID rate was vastly above rates almost anywhere in Africa, certainly in South Africa and Botswana, and the death rates have been huge. And yet, in Britain, this is the pandemic. In South Africa, Southern Africa, other parts of Africa, it is African disease. And I see I've only got a minute left. The other disease frame example was related to the Beninois singer Angelique Kidjo, who in 2014 was leading a concert in honor of your great singer, Miriam Makeba, known as Mama Africa in Europe. People started putting on social media, this concert should not be called Mama Africa, it should be called Mama Ebola. And so I can see Tebogo there waiting for me to shut up. I can talk until your ears bleed, so I'll make sure I do shut up. You get these stereotypical frames, and the job of people in South Africa, in the PR industry, and in politics in South Africa, you've got problems to overcome in politics, but you need to really concentrate on successes and get successes like isolating Omicron was a success. There are many other things that I could say about South Africa. I mean, even you have political problems. There is still violence, but look where you were in 1990 and look at the problems. I mean, we are still facing the possible breakup of the United Kingdom in what the newspapers should be calling Scottish tribal separatism, but it's not, it's Scottish nationalism. And on that note, I will end. And if there is time for questions, I'm very, very happy to answer anything you want to throw at me.
Wow, that was very, very cool. Wow, Professor Somerville, thank you so much for that presentation. I actually wasn't trying to get you to stop. I was just enjoying the framing. And I wanted to thank you for taking your time, for coming at the last minute, because I just asked you very recently on Twitter to come and join us. And I think it's refreshing to see someone who is based in Europe looking at Africa as it should, you know, seeing issues as they should be seen. And as you spoke about crime, I was walking the other day and I was just thinking, you know, we report a lot about the crime, and maybe we do not report about the peace because it's not as dramatic and it can't be sensationalized. But maybe we need to, as Petunia has said in the comment section, we need to have a counter frame of Africa. When you frame us as the continent of disease, perhaps we should say, well, we have isolated the Omicron variant so that we can tackle it, so that we can recognize it and tackle it. You know, and I think without not ignoring our challenges and trying to downplay some of the difficulties that we do have, but it shouldn't be a biased approach where we only focus on the difficulties and we try to frame it in a way that suits the stereotype. So I'd like to thank you so much for your contribution. It was very inspiring. The audience here loved it. It's just unfortunate we couldn't show everyone, but we will now go to any questions we have on the floor or online for Professor Keith Somerville. We'd really appreciate if you could provide any of those questions about framing articles in the African context or stories in the African context. You can raise your hand if you're online or anyone in the room.
While we wait, I'll just reply to Petunia. Yes, you need to get counterframes, as you said, Tebogo. You need to, there's an old song, accentuate the positive. And also another point, which following on from what you said, and that is there is a thing in journalism, not just about South Africa or Africa, but everywhere, an old expression which is sadly still true: if it bleeds, it leads. In other words, violence will lead, whereas solutions to violence don't necessarily lead. The only ones I can think that didn't lead in that way was the period immediately after the 1994 elections, which I had the pleasure to report on directly from South Africa, where the world saw Madiba's approach to reconciliation, and this became the story. Sadly, good news stories or optimistic stories, they disappear like smoke in the wind, and the bleeding leading comes back.
And I think maybe they're playing on our bias towards fear as human beings and trying to play on that to catch people's interest. And I think I just wanted to thank you for the last time and just say the insights that you've provided are very useful for us, because we can now look at how stories are framed about Africa, think about how can we challenge those, and also think about how we can reframe, because in as much as all over the world we have challenges, but we also have great stories to tell. And if we look at it in the context of public relations and marketing, what is the role of public relations and marketing? They play a role in growing sustainable businesses. Your marketing is what brings you to your audience. And so if your entire continent is being marketed poorly, then it speaks about your ability to grow internationally competitive companies, and just the relationships that you'd have internationally may be framed with that particular stereotype. So it's very damaging. So Professor Somerville, thank you so much.
Can I just answer the question from Mandisa?
Yes.
Very good one, because actually I know Prince Harry. I've met him. I liked him. He did a lot of good work. I met him because sadly my son broke his neck playing rugby when he was 16 and is paralyzed from the chest down and will never walk again. He has to use a wheelchair. Prince Harry was, I think he's now had it taken away from him, the patron of the Injured Rugby Players Foundation that supported injured rugby players. And we met him at an event at a rugby match. And he was there was no, you've got to treat me as a royal, you've got to bow and scrape before me. He was a decent man who talked to us, just as though he was just another member of the rugby community. There's that. I think he was not surprisingly unbelievably affected by the death of his mother, who I also knew because I knew her through her work on landmines and campaigns to lift landmines. During the 1995 Rugby World Cup, I was in Angola going out with landmine clearance teams to make a program about that and about the horror of landmines. So I met her. She was a troubled person, and I think Harry in his way is troubled, but there is always this thing about the royal family in Britain. They are supposedly refer to themselves as the firm, as though they're in a corporate identity. And the firm's image and position is everything. And if somebody steps out of line, as Harry has done, and criticizes the royal family and criticizes the way things are done, he is cast out, and then most of the British media will follow that up. And of course, there is the racism about Meghan Markle. A lot of the articles when they were first engaged and then married, barely hidden stream of racism throughout. And you can compare it until it became obvious he was totally guilty with how easily Prince Andrew got away with his horrible behavior, his disgusting behavior. And yet Harry, who's trying to live his own life and still do things that are positive, is absolutely a target now for the British media.
Perfect. Professor, we have another question from the Vice President of PRISA, Puti Mutapo. Her name is Puti. She wants to ask, what is your view on the situation in Ukraine as it pertains to how Africans are being treated at the borders?
That is, again, a very good one, Puti. There are two things about the way the Ukraine is being reported. I have to say, thankfully, Channel 4 News in Britain has had several pieces on Ghanaian, Nigerian, and other African students who are studying in Ukraine, who've got to the Polish border, and the Poles, who in other ways have been very, very admirable, don't extend this to African and also Asians who are trapped in the Ukraine. They were taking Ukrainians, their fellow Europeans, and I've heard a Polish politician who was interviewed saying, this is so shocking because we're seeing this happening to blonde-haired, blue-eyed Europeans. And to resume my attack on the British royal family, Prince William last week visited a Ukrainian community centre and sympathized with Ukrainians, which is great. But he again said, this does not happen in Europe. We expect this sort of thing to happen in Africa and Asia. So there is a double standard. And when you look at the coverage of the appalling refugee crisis, and it is appalling, what Putin is doing is appalling. What is happening to Ukrainians is absolutely terrible. But when you look at the way that is reported, say to the way the conflict still going on in Tigray, in Ethiopia, is being reported, Ukrainians have names. They are interviewed. Tigrayans, Ethiopians are, and I apologize for using this expression, just a mass of more Africans in trouble, and they're in trouble because the continent is a basket case, which of course it isn't, but that is the way it is presented. And the plight of the foreign students in Ukraine is just underreported. I don't think I've seen anything on the BBC other than on the BBC's Online for Africa site about it. It's not getting in the newspapers. These are just, you know, more unfortunate foreigners. They're not Europeans like us. And that is one of these things. Cultural proximity is a very important thing, and cultural proximity easily melts into racism. So yes, the way this is being reported, their plight is underreported, but also the way the Ukrainian refugee situation is reported, that is the way you should report it. But then you don't report it like that for Africa and Asia. You didn't report it like that for refugee crisis in Africa. And people will praise Poland, but when did you hear people praise Tanzania, for example, when they took in Rwandan refugees, when they took in refugees from Uganda at times. You don't hear African countries praised. In the Middle East, you don't hear Jordan praised for taking in hundreds of thousands of Syrians. Yet Poland, when they take it in, and yes, they should be praised, except for keeping out the African students, they get praised. It's this constant double standard. Shit happens, if you pardon me, shit happens in Africa, it shouldn't happen in Europe.